Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Revelation class. This morning we are in class number 26, and we're going to do two chapters today of Ezekiel, chapters 31 and 32, and we are in Egypt still. There are actually 4 chapters of Ezekiel that are about Egypt and the judgments that are going to come on Egypt. So obviously the Lord pays particular attention to Egypt, and that's because Egypt is Israel's oldest enemy, going back way back. So today we're going to be in that. Just a little bit about the structure of the book here for a minute. In chapters 1 through, there are 48 chapters in Ezekiel, and in the first half of the book it's about Israel and the sins that Israel has committed and the judgments that God is preparing and is now sending against Israel. In the part that we're in right now, chapters 25 through 32, it's about the Gentile nations, the sins that they're committing and the judgments that are going to be coming against them. And it's clear that God is going to punish Israel for her sins, but she's also going to punish unbelieving Gentiles for her sins as well. So this is kind of the doom and gloom part, if you will, of Ezekiel. A lot of people never quite get through this part, but starting next week, we get into the good stuff. We get into what the Lord has in store. What the Lord has in store for Israel in the future, and what the Lord has in store for believers in the future. So that's where we are in the book. We're at the transition point this week. We're just finishing up. This will be the last part about the Gentile nations, and next week we'll be going into the future. And we'll be looking not only at Israel's future, but at our future as well, as we look at that. Remember that the book of Ezekiel is based around 13 visions that the Lord gave to Ezekiel, and we're going to blast through 3 of them today, visions 9, 10, and 11. So we're going to be going into those today. We've already done 8 of them so far. So we're going to begin in chapter 31 and verses 1 and 2. Let me read you those verses first. And this, by the way, is the beginning of the 9th vision. These are in your handouts. Oh, for those of you joining us at home, welcome. We are delighted to have you with us today. Please open your Bibles to the opening chapter, or the opening verses of Ezekiel chapter 31. So this is verses 1 and 2 of Ezekiel 31. In the 11th year, in the 3rd month, on the 1st day, the word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, say to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and to his hordes, who can be compared with you in majesty? So we are on a very specific day here, and that day is the 11th year, the 3rd month, the 1st day. We can actually put that on the calendar. That is June 11th of 587 BC. That date is in your notes. So Ezekiel's very precise, as we've seen all the way through here. He gives us very precise stuff to work with. So that's the date that we're going to be working with here. Now let's continue on. I'm going to take you through verses 3 through 9 next, which is going to be about comparing Pharaoh to a cedar tree in Lebanon. Consider Assyria, once a cedar in Lebanon, with beautiful branches overshadowing the forest. It towered on high, its top above the thick foliage. The waters nourished it. Deep springs made it grow tall. Their streams flowed all around its base and sent their channels to all the trees of the field. So it towered higher than all the trees of the field. Its boughs increased and its branches grew long, spreading because of abundant waters. All the birds of the sky nested in its boughs. All the animals of the wild gave birth under its branches. All the great nations lived in its shade. Maybe we're not talking about a tree here. It was majestic in beauty, with its spreading boughs, for its roots went down to abundant waters. The cedars in the garden of God could not rival it, nor could the junipers equal its boughs, nor could the plane trees compare with its branches. No tree in the garden of God could match its beauty. This would be the Lord, I made it beautiful with abundant branches, the envy of all the trees of Eden in the garden of God. So, the Lord here is about to compare Pharaoh to a giant cedar of Lebanon. Now, today the cedars of Lebanon are gone. They were actually cut down by the Turks back in the 1500s through the 1800s. The Turks actually put a tax on trees. So people cut down all the trees so they wouldn't have to pay tax to the Turks. The Turks ruled Lebanon during that period. So the cedars of Lebanon are gone today, but at the time they were the greatest trees in the whole Middle East, and they were the greatest trees in the known world at that point. Today we know there are bigger trees in California, but they didn't know that in those days. So these were gigantic trees. They were very high, very tall. They had put out huge amounts of shade. And they had sunk deep, deep roots down until they could find a really good water supply down in the ground. You can see the roots going down into the ground here. And they were, and they just overwhelmed all the other trees around them. If you take a look at the other trees were out here. The other trees were out here in the garden. The other trees were just overwhelmed by the majesty of these trees. And animals were underneath. They were having their babies down here. They were getting shade from the hot sun. Birds are up here in the air setting up nests and having their eggs and all that stuff. So they were beautiful, beautiful trees. The Lord is comparing Pharaoh to a cedar in Lebanon. And he's explaining how this tree is, he said, who can be compared with you in majesty? This is a majestic tree. It was, by the way, these trees were used in the construction of the temple in Jerusalem. These are massive trees. So these are beautiful, beautiful trees. And who can be compared with you in your majesty? Well, that should be the key right there, that we're talking about more than just a tree. We're talking about somebody who was majestic, a king, in this case, a Pharaoh of Egypt. And the Lord talks about how the tree actually gets its water, gets everything up there, how the beautiful shade that it puts out, the fact that it dominates all the other trees in the area. This particular type of tree was just way, way bigger than any other tree that was in that area at that point in time. And that it was just beautiful and it was majestic. So now we're going to continue on into verses 10 through 14. Let me read that next. So far we just talked about the tree. We haven't really related this back to Pharaoh yet. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Because the great cedar towered over the thick foliage, because it was proud of its height, I gave it into the hands of the ruler of nations, for him to deal with according to its wickedness. I cast it aside, and the most ruthless of foreign nations cut it down and left it. Its boughs fell on the mountains and in the valleys. Its branches lay broken in all the ravines of the land. All the nations of the earth came out from under its shade and left it. All the birds settled on the fallen tree, and all the wild animals lived among its branches. Therefore no other trees by the waters are ever to tower proudly on high, lifting their tops above the thick foliage. No other trees so well watered are ever to reach such a height. They are all destined for death, for the earth below, among mortals who go down into the realm of the dead. So obviously we're talking about something a lot more than a tree here. That makes it pretty clear in those verses. And what we're talking about is Pharaoh, and Pharaoh in Egypt. That will become even more obvious as we go a little further on here. Pharaoh, the Lord is saying that Pharaoh was like one of these giant cedar trees, that he was majestic, he was gigantic, he was above everything, that the whole rest of Egypt was in his shadow. The rest of Egypt was the little trees out here. And, excuse me, they were all in his shadow. He was the one who protected them from the sun. He was the one who gave them the animals and the birds that they, or gave them homes for the animals and the birds that they used for themselves. He was the one who was around the water, the Nile River, and who used that water to nourish Egypt. That was how he viewed himself. That's not how the Lord views him, but that's how he viewed himself. He viewed himself as being absolutely essential to Egypt. that because of him, Egypt had life. He was very, very proud, as we're going to see as we go through this. And he had a lot of pride that, he was a god in his own mind. He considered himself a god. A lot of rulers thought that way in those days. I think we have some today that think that way as well. A lot of rulers thought that way in those days. And he viewed himself as some kind of god who brought life to his people. And the people of Egypt actually worshipped him that way, as though he brought life to his people. The Nile River flowed from him. We talked about that last week. He viewed that the Nile River was something that he had created. Obviously, that's silly. We all know God created the Nile River, not him. So we see that the Lord is about to give it over to the hands of the ruler of nations. The ruler of nations is the king of Babylon. We studied last week how God gave the king of Babylon, back in Daniel 2:37 and 38, the ability to control the entire world. God said, you can have it all. You can have the entire world. We studied that verse last week. So the ruler of Babylon started to do that. He began to conquer all the nations around him, and he's now coming to conquer Egypt. He's about to conquer Egypt. So God is going to give Egypt over to the ruler of nations, who is the king of Babylon. That's what's about to happen here. First, Israel's going to fall, and then Tyre, and then after that, it will be Egypt's turn next. He says that the most ruthless of foreign nations will cut it down. So they're going to cut this tree down. Boom, they're going to take it right down. And when they do, its boughs are going to fall all over the place. Its leaves are going to fall all over the place. And it's going to be no more. And it will just lay on the ground. And the birds of the air will still be able to build some nests in it, but they won't be building nests way up here. They'll be building nests as it's laying on the ground down here, where other animals can get to them. And the animals won't be able to be under it anymore, because the shade will be gone. And its boughs, it says, are going to fall all over the mountains and the valleys and the ravines of the land. So obviously a tree is not going to fall that way, but Pharaoh, when he falls, Egypt is going to be destroyed through all of Egypt, mountains, valleys, ravines, everything. It says, all the nations of the earth came out from under its shade and left it. Now, Egypt was the leader of the world for a long time. I mean, a couple of thousand years. Egypt led the world. They were the leading world power. And people all around the world kind of kowtowed to Egypt. They sent gifts to Egypt. They sent ambassadors there. And they sought protection from Egypt against their enemies. So everybody was trying to play with Egypt during that period. Well, that's not going to happen anymore because Egypt's about to be destroyed. So, talks about no other trees will ever go as high as this one did. And what that means is that this is the last time when the Babylonians actually defeat Egypt, which is going to happen in 568 BC. That will be the last time a member of the Egyptian royal family ever sits on the throne of Egypt. It has never happened since then. So the Egyptian royal family was thrown out at that point in time by the Babylonians. They never came back. The Babylonians ruled Egypt after that, and then the Persians ruled Egypt, and then Alexander the Great and the Greeks ruled Egypt, and then the Romans ruled Egypt, and then the Muslims ruled Egypt, and then the British eventually ruled Egypt, and today Egypt has its own government, but they are not certainly not the royal family leading Egypt today. So Egypt has never again had a person like a pharaoh, a person of the royal family that has ruled over it since that point in time. And then it goes on in verse 14 to say that not only are they going to be killed by the Babylonians, but they're going to go down to the realm of the dead. So they're not only going to be physically killed, but they're going to end up in hell. They're going to end up in Hades. That's because they are sinful. They have not accepted the Lord. They have not sought the Lord. So they are going to end up going down to the realm of the dead. The realm of the dead is Hades. Questions on that before we move on? Let me move on to verse 15 now, and we're going to do 15 through, what here, let's see. 15 through 18 we're going to do next. This is what the sovereign Lord says. On that day it was brought down to the realm of the dead. I covered the deep springs with mourning for it. I held back its streams, and its abundant waters were restrained. Because of it I clothed Lebanon with gloom, and all the trees of the field withered away. I made the nations tremble at the sound of its fall, and I brought it down to the realm of the dead to be with those who go down to the pit. Then all the trees of Eden, the choicest, the best of Lebanon, the well-watered trees, were consoled in the earth below. They too, like the great cedar, had gone down to the realm of the dead, to those killed by the sword, along with the armed men who lived in its shade among the nations. Which of the trees of Eden can be compared with you in splendor and majesty? Yet you too will be brought down with the trees of Eden to the earth below. You will lie among the uncircumcised with those killed by the sword. This is Pharaoh and all his hordes, declares the sovereign Lord. So if it wasn't obvious by that point, we now know we're talking about Pharaoh here. Pharaoh is the tree. The Lord just stated it there. So we're going to continue on with the story. On the day it was brought down, so that's the day that the Babylonians come in and destroy Egypt, the people not only are destroyed and killed, but they end up in hell. They end up in Hades. So they go down to the realm of the dead. And the Lord says he's going to cover the deep springs with mourning for it. So the water that was all around here is going to be covered. It's going to no longer nourish Pharaoh, and it's no longer going to nourish the nation of Egypt, which is these little trees that are drawing from the water as well. So Egypt is going to suffer when this happens. The people of Egypt are going to suffer. It's not just Pharaoh, but the people of Egypt are going to suffer when God does this to Egypt. It says, because of it I clothed Lebanon with gloom. So there's gloom coming, right? This is going to be a pretty gloomy time to be an Egyptian. Now Lebanon he's talking about Lebanon because the trees actually grow in Lebanon. They don't really grow in Egypt. Egypt is just a desert. But the trees themselves actually grow in Lebanon. But everybody in the Middle East knew these were the greatest trees in the world at that time. It says, I made the nations tremble at the sound of its fall when I brought it down to the realm of the dead, to be with those who go down with the pit. So the nations around it, who had for thousands of years depended on Egypt to protect them and to keep them safe, and and they sent tributes and money and gifts to Egypt to gain favor with the Pharaoh. All of a sudden, those nations are on their own. Those nations are now facing the Babylonians, who are the greatest power in the world now. And the Babylonians aren't going to be very sympathetic to people that were with Egypt, right? So the Babylonians are going to come after those people as well, and they did. All of Egypt's client states that were around it were all pretty much taken over by the Babylonians at that time. So the Babylonians are going to change things, and people are going to be terrified at the fall of Egypt. It would be like if the United States fell today. People around the world that depend on us would be terrified by it, right? Think about the situation in 1940 when France fell. And England and France were looked at as the two good powers in Europe at that time. And England was not surrounded, but cut off from most of Europe. It was a dark time, similar time to what we're looking at here. And then it says, I brought it down to the realm of the dead, to those who go down to the pit. The pit is used many, many times in the Bible to reflect the place of Hades, the place which we refer to today as hell in our culture, but in the Bible it's called Hades, and that is the place where souls go when they are condemned. Then all the trees of Eden, the choicest and best of Lebanon, the well-watered trees, were consoled in the earth below. Now there's an interesting concept. All the other people, the Egyptians, and the other people around the Middle East who depended on Pharaoh for protection, they were all sinners too. And they're all going to end up in Hades as well. They're all going to end up in the pit. And the Lord says they're going to console each other. Now, I can't imagine it's going to be very consoling to be in Hades for eternity. But the Lord says they're going to console each other, which I think is kind of tongue-in-cheek. I think what the Lord's really saying here is kind of goes back to the old saying of misery likes company. People who are going to be in a miserable state at least will know that there are lots of other people in a miserable state that are all around them. Right? So I think that's what the Lord is talking about here in this particular verse. They too, like the great cedar, had gone down to the realm of the dead, to those killed by the sword, along with the armed men who lived in its shade among the nations. So the people of all these countries, or not only are the countries and the rulers of these countries going to end up in Hades, but the people of these countries who didn't seek the Lord are going to be there too. So Pharaoh's going down because of the Babylonians. The rulers of all the other nations are going down. The people of Egypt are going down, and the people of all these other nations, if they haven't sought the Lord, are going down. This is not going to be a good time for any of them, and they all realize it when they see the Babylonians take over and defeat Egypt. They know that things are not going to be good for them. And at least they'll be able to console each other in Hades. Which of the trees of Eden can be compared with you in splendor and majesty? Yet you too will be brought down with the trees of Eden to the earth below. You will lie among the uncircumcised with those killed by the sword. So the Lord is saying here that this tree is not only going to be cut down and fall to the earth, but the people under it, the people of Egypt and the people in all these other places, are going to go down even further. They're going to go down all the way into Hades when it falls. So the tree's going to fall and hit the ground, but the people are going to continue on down into Hades, is kind of what the Lord is talking about here. Now, he says, you will be among the uncircumcised. Now, the Jews will have instantly understood what that means. To the Jews, what Jewish males were required to be circumcised. That goes all the way back to the time of Abraham. That was what set them apart, physically set them apart from other people. So the Jews will understand that we're talking here about people who are uncircumcised, people who are not with God. They are not God's people. In those days, the Jews would have understood that as being Gentiles. So we're talking here about Gentile nations that are going to be doing this. Let me see if I left anything out of this before I move on. I think we got it all. Any questions on any of that, chapter 31, before we move on? This is the concept that Pharaoh is like the cedars of Lebanon, like a giant cedar of Lebanon that's about to be cut down. Okay, in chapter 32, we're going to move to my other pieces of artwork up here. Excuse my artwork. Those of you that have been with me a while know that artwork is not my thing. So in chapter 32, I'm going to read you verses 1 through 16. I'm going to talk about that, and this is about another image of Pharaoh, a different image of Pharaoh. In the 12th year, in the 12th month, on the first day. Let me stop for a minute. So we are now looking at the 10th vision of Ezekiel. This is now a new vision. It's different even than the last chapter. This is a new vision coming to Ezekiel from God on a different day. So we're in the 12th month, in the 12th year, on the first day. The word of the Lord came to me. Excuse me. Son of man, take up a lament concerning Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and say to him, you are like a lion among the nations. You are like a monster in the seas, thrashing about in your streams, churning the water with your feet and muddying the streams. This is what the sovereign Lord says. With a great throng of people I will cast my net over you. And they will haul you up in my net. I will throw you on the land and hurl you on the open field. I will let all the birds of the sky settle on you, and all the animals of the wild gorge themselves on you. I will spread your flesh on the mountains. I will fill the valleys with your remains. I will drench the land with your living blood. Sounds great, doesn't it? All the way to the mountains, and the ravines will be filled with your flesh. When I snuff you out, I will cover the heavens and darken their stars. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon will not give its light. All the shining lights in the heavens I will darken over you. I will bring darkness over your land, declares the sovereign Lord. I will trouble the hearts of many peoples when I bring about your destruction among the nations. Among lands you have not known, I will cause many peoples to be appalled by you, and their kings will shudder with horror because of you, when I brandish my sword before them. On the day of your downfall, each of them will tremble, every moment for his life. For this is what the sovereign Lord says. The sword of the king of Babylon will come against you. I will cause your hordes to fall. By the swords of mighty men, the most ruthless of all nations, they will shatter the pride of Egypt, and all her hordes will be overthrown. I will destroy all her cattle from beside abundant waters, no longer to be stirred by the foot of man, or muddied by the hooves of cattle. Then I will let her waters settle, and make her streams flow like oil, declares the sovereign Lord. When I make Egypt desolate and strip the land of everything in it, when I strike down all who live there, then they will know that I am the Lord. This is the lament they will chant for her. The daughters of the nations will chant it for Egypt, and all her hordes they will chant it, declares the sovereign Lord. Now, this is actually in the form, if you can look at the layout of this on your page, you can see this is in the form of a poem. It's in the form of a song, a chant, if you will. Much of the Bible is that way, and if you actually read it in Hebrew, you would be able to chant it or sing it almost like a song. Now, we are not reading it in Hebrew, so it doesn't connect as a song to us or as a chant or whatever. But just so you know, that's what's being talked about here. This is almost like a funeral dirge for Egypt that the Lord is singing, if you will, for Egypt. So first of all, it's a lament over Pharaoh and over Egypt and over all the people that were with Egypt. They will be no more. It's a funeral dirge, as I said. It's in a poetic format. This vision is dated March the 3rd of 585 BC, and this is the 10th vision. So it's March the 3rd, 585 BC. And it begins by comparing Pharaoh to three different things. First of all, it says, you are a lion among the nations. I decided not to try to put a picture of the Sphinx up here because my artwork is not good enough to draw a Sphinx. But those of you that have ever seen a picture of the Sphinx in Egypt, pardon me, this is tree season here. I'm not allergic to cedar trees, but I am allergic to some trees that are blooming right now, and this has been an interesting week. So the Sphinx in Egypt picks up this concept, the idea that the Pharaoh, who has a head like a pharaoh, has a body like a lion. In other words, he has the heart of a lion, he has the strength of a lion, he has that ability that a lion has. And that's the whole concept of the Sphinx in Egypt. The pharaohs looked at themselves that way. They were very prideful people. They looked at themselves as having the head of themselves, a pharaoh, but having the body of a lion. I didn't draw that up here, but that's what it's the first thing God's talking about. You are like a lion among the nations. Talking about Pharaoh here. Thrashing about in your streams. We talked about that last week, right? Crocodiles are what thrash about in the streams of Egypt. So, and crocodiles get down in the mud where you can't see them very well, and they wait. And they wait for something to come along. And then they eat whatever comes along, right? They're predators. They're waiting for, they're not very fast, but they sit there in the streams, in the mud, waiting for something to come along, and then they come, jump up and grab it and eat it. So that's kind of what Pharaoh is. He's a predator, if you will. God is saying he's a predator. And then the third thing it talks about is you are like a monster in the seas. Now, the monster in the seas we see in a whole lot of places in the scriptures, going all the way back to Job. The monster in this, and it continues all the way into Revelation. And Job calls him Leviathan. The book of Job calls him Leviathan. By the time we get to Revelation, he's called the beast who comes out of the sea. This is the same person in Scripture. Let me just kind of pick up some of those references for you. Let's take a look first of all at Job 41:1. Can you pull in the Leviathan with a fishhook, or tie down his tongue with a rope? And then he goes on. He actually has some other references to Leviathan down here, but it's the idea that Leviathan is a beast from the sea. He's a gigantic beast. People were afraid of sea creatures back in those days. There's still some of that today. People still today talk about the giant squids in the sea and things like that, sharks. People talk about, creatures that are below the sea that are slithering around out there. So Job picked that up with Leviathan, and then we picked it up again with Jonah, obviously, with the big fish that went after Jonah. And then we see it again in Isaiah 27:1. Let me pick up Isaiah 27:1 for you. In that day the Lord will punish with his sword, his fierce, great, and powerful sword, Leviathan the gliding serpent, Leviathan the coiling serpent. He will slay the monster of the sea. In that day is talking about the time when Jesus comes back. It's a day that hasn't happened yet. That's a phrase that's used in the Bible. So the Lord will slay the beast of the sea. The beast of the sea is something that we see at the midpoint of the tribulation. Basically, the Antichrist gets killed. He has a mortal wound, and Satan resurrects him. It's the only point in the Bible where Satan ever does a resurrection of anyone. Satan resurrects him and indwells himself in him. And at that point, apparently he does that by the sea or in the sea, and he comes out of the sea as the beast of the sea in Revelation, at the midpoint of the book of Revelation. That is Leviathan. That's the Leviathan that's being talked about here in Isaiah 27:1. That on that day the Lord will slay Leviathan. So the Lord will slay the Antichrist on the day, the beast, on the day that Jesus returns. Now, those of you that were in my Revelation class know that the beast has 7 heads. So I put 7 heads up on the beast, but the Lord is comparing Pharaoh to Leviathan. So he's saying Pharaoh is essentially is essentially a picture of the Antichrist that is to come. So, and that's here when he's being looked at the ultimate beast in the Bible that will eventually come in a time in our future. Here he's the great predator, and here he's the very prideful person who shades the world and gives the world so much blessing in his own mind, at least. So that's what the Lord is comparing him to in this opening passage here. Questions on that? So, moving back on here. Oh, the Lord says he's going to cast a net over him and he's going to haul him in. So he's going to, this is looking at the concept of Pharaoh as being a crocodile. They hauled crocodiles in Egypt in those days with these giant hooks that they would get in their jaws, and then a whole bunch of guys would pull him up out of the water, and once he got up out of the water, he didn't have the same capabilities anymore. So that was how they killed crocodiles in those days. And then eventually they throw a net over him and let him die on the in the desert heat. It wouldn't take long for a creature that lives in water and that needs water to die in the desert heat in the sun. So that was how they dealt with crocodiles in those days, and that's what he's talking about here when he says that he's going to pull him up out of the stream. It says, "I will cast my net over you, and they will haul you up in my net. I will throw you on the land and hurl you on the open field, and let all the birds of the sky settle on you, and all the animals of the wild gorge themselves on you." Now this also goes back to a scene in Revelation. It goes back to a scene in Revelation 19, verses 17 and 18, where after the army of the beast has been defeated by Jesus, the birds of the air come and gorge themselves on the bodies of the dead soldiers, of the dead evil people. So that relates forward to what we saw in Revelation. Anybody want me to read that one to you? That's in Revelation 19, verses 17 through 18. And then it goes on to talk about how the blood will flow out from all of that. This is actually in Revelation 14, verse 20. And let me continue on with the verse here. I will spread your flesh on the mountains and fill the valleys with your remains. I will drench the land with your flowing blood all the way to the mountains, and the ravines will be filled with your flesh. Let's go back and take a look at Revelation 14, verse 20, and see how that relates back here. They were trampled in this is the people who are being killed by Christ at the second coming. They were trampled in the winepress outside the city. That's in the Valley of Hinnom in Jerusalem. They were trampled in the winepress outside the city. The blood flowed out of the press, rising as high as the horses' bridles for a distance of 1,600 stadia. That's about 180 miles. So blood is going to flow for 180 miles because there's going to be so many dead people in the Valley of Hinnom when Jesus destroys the Antichrist's army. So that's what's being talked about here, that Pharaoh is not only a vision of the Antichrist, but he's a vision of what's going to happen to the Antichrist. Namely, that there will be blood all over the place when Pharaoh and his people are killed by the Babylonians. Any questions on that before we move on? So let me move on a little bit further. When I snuff you out, I will cover the heavens and darken the stars. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon will not give its light. All the shining lights in the heavens I will darken over you. I will bring darkness over the land, declares the Lord. Now that is picking up something that Jesus himself said in Matthew 24. Let me pick that up for you. Again, this is talking about something that's in our future today. This is not something that's happened yet. Let me pick up from Matthew 24, and that is verses, let's see, where are we at again? Verses 28 through 30. This is about the time of the tribulation when Jesus comes back. Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. Immediately after the distress of those days, in other words, right when Jesus comes back, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the nations of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. So this is talking about the time when Jesus comes back, a time that, again, is still in our future. We have not seen this yet. This has not happened at any time in history yet. It's going to happen in our future as well. And he's talking about Pharaoh as a picture of that as well, that when Pharaoh falls, that's going to be a picture of what's going to happen when the Antichrist falls, when the beast falls to Jesus. Then he says, I will trouble the hearts of many people when I bring about your destruction among the nations, among lands you have not known. So people all around the world who were dependent on Egypt for various things are all going to say, uh-oh, what's going to happen to us next, right? This reminds us of what happened when Tyre fell a number of weeks ago. Same thing. When Egypt falls, all the people who depend on Egypt for various things, including protection, are going to realize there's no protection anymore. The Babylonians are coming at them too, and there's nothing they can do about it. So they're going to fall as well, just like Egypt did. Anybody who put their faith in Egypt rather than in God is going to fall at that time, including Israel. I will cause many peoples to be appalled at you, and their kings will shudder with horror because of you when I brandish my sword before them. On the day of your downfall, each of them will tremble every moment of his life. So all the people who are buddies with Egypt are all going to be worried about their own futures. But this is what the sovereign Lord says. The sword of the king of Babylon will come against you. I will cause your hordes to fall by the swords of mighty men, the most ruthless of all nations. They will shatter the pride of Egypt, and all her hordes will be overthrown. So Egypt's about to be overthrown. And then the Lord goes on to talk about the kind of destruction that's going to happen. Some of this is going to happen now. When I say now, I mean in Ezekiel's time. Some of it is coming yet, later in the future. So the Lord is mixing prophecies in what he's about to say here. I will destroy all her cattle from beside her abundant waters, no longer to be stirred up by the foot of man, or muddied by the hooves of cattle. Then I will let her waters settle and make her streams flow like oil. So this is now talking about that period we talked about last week, the 40 years at the beginning of the millennial kingdom, when the Lord is going to have no people left in Egypt. So the waters of Egypt are going to be like oil. They're not going to flow. The Lord is going to basically drive everybody out of Egypt. They're going to flow like oil. When I make Egypt desolate and strip the land of everything in it, the Lord is talking about here. When I strike down all who live there, then they will know that I am the Lord. We see that phrase a whole lot in the Bible. Whenever God is about to punish somebody, he says, then they will know that I am the Lord. They will know that although the Babylonians are the ones coming in with the swords and killing them, physically killing them, the Lord's really the one who's behind it. The Lord will destroy Egypt so thoroughly at this time yet to come, that they will know that it could only be the Lord. This is not something that ordinary human beings could do at the level of destruction that they will see. So let me move on now to the conclusion here, which is verses 17 through 31. Let me read that to you next. In the 12th year, on the 15th day of the month, the word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, wail for the hordes of Egypt, and consign to the earth below both her and the daughters of mighty nations, along with those who go down to the pit. Say to them, are you more favored than others? Go down and be laid among the uncircumcised. They will fall among those killed by the sword. The sword is drawn. Let her be dragged off with all her hordes. From within the realm of the dead, the mighty leaders will say of Egypt and her allies, they have come down and they lie with the uncircumcised, with those killed by the sword. Assyria is there with her whole army. She is surrounded by the graves of all her slain, all who have fallen by the sword. Their graves are in the depths of the pit, and her army lies around her grave. All who had spread terror in the land of the living are slain, fallen by the sword. Elam is there, with all her hordes around her grave. All of them are slain, fallen by the sword. All who had spread terror in the land of the living went down uncircumcised to the earth below. They bear their shame, and those who go down to the pit, with those who go down to the pit. A bed is made for her among the slain, with all her hordes around her grave. All of them are uncircumcised, killed by the sword. Because their terror had spread to the land of the living, they bear their shame with those who go down to the pit. They are laid among the slain. Meshach and Tubal are there, with all their hordes around their graves. All of them are uncircumcised, killed by the sword, because they spread their terror in the land of the living. But they do not lie with the fallen warriors of old, who went down to the realms of the dead with their weapons of war, their swords placed under their heads and shields, resting on their bones. Though these warriors also had terrorized the land of the living. You too, Pharaoh, will be broken, and will lie among the uncircumcised, with those killed by the sword. Edom is there, her kings and her princes, despite their power, they are laid with those killed by the sword. They lie with the uncircumcised, with those who go down to the pit. All the princes of the north and all the Sidonians are there. They went down with the slain in disgrace, despite the terror caused by their power. They lie uncircumcised with those killed by the sword, and bear their shame and go down with those who go down to the pit. Pharaoh, he and all his army will see them, and he will be consoled, for all his hordes that were killed by the sword, declares the sovereign Lord. Although I had him spread terror in the land of the living, Pharaoh and all his hordes will be laid among the uncircumcised, with those killed by the sword, declares the sovereign Lord. Okay, so there's a whole lot of themes in there. By the way, again, we are now beginning the 11th vision, and that is on the 12th year on the 15th day. So this is 14 days after the previous one. So God is telling Ezekiel that the hordes of Egypt, all the people of Egypt, are going to go down with Pharaoh if they haven't accepted God, and not many people in Egypt had at that time. If they weren't following the Lord, they were going to go down with Egypt to the pit. And you'll see words like uncircumcised come up all the time in here. I'm not going to hit the word of uncircumcised appears about 8 or 10 times in here. That is talking about people who are not Jews, who have not accepted the Lord. And that's true in our world today. That's people who have not accepted the world today. They may be circumcised physically, but if their hearts aren't circumcised, they're not going to be there. They will go down to the pit. They will be in with people who have drawn the swords, and with all the hordes of all the armies that have drawn the swords and killed people for evil purposes. From within the realm of the dead, the various leaders, mighty leaders, will all be there with the Egyptians. They'll all be there together in Hades. And then it talks about 7 specific Gentile nations. Now, 7 in the Bible, every time you see it, is the number for completeness. So when you see, we're only going to list 7 specific Gentile nations here, but in essence what the Lord is saying, Gentile nations that don't accept him, this is for you. He's going to give us specifically 7 of them, but he's talking about all Gentile nations, and we are a Gentile nation, America. We are a Gentile nation. All Gentile nations that do not accept him, her people are going to be heading in this direction if they don't accept him. And he talks first about Assyria. Assyria, the Egyptians knew about Assyria because they were the first people to conquer Egypt. They conquered Egypt before the Babylonians. So the Egyptians knew about Assyria. They knew how evil those people were. And then there's Elam is the second one. Elam is actually to the east of Israel. Not exactly clear. Elam was a pretty small nation in those days. Most biblical scholars think that Ezekiel here is talking about Persia. Persia would be the next empire to come along after the Babylonians that would also conquer Egypt, and that was about 50 years after this. Persia came along and then conquered Babylonia first, and then eventually conquered Egypt. So most people think he's talking about Persia here. And it says their people are going to get down to the pit as well. In other words, their people are going to not only be killed by others, but their people are going to end up in Hades as well. And then he talks about Meshech and Tubal. Now, Meshech and Tubal are located in eastern Turkey. Those were the areas that Cain went to after he killed Abel. He went up there and had his family and settled that area up in eastern Turkey. So Meshech and Tubal would be an area up there that is going to be, their warrior. They've sent warriors around and killed people as well in that part of the world, and they're going to be there. Then he says, you too, Pharaoh, will be broken and will be among the uncircumcised. So Pharaoh's going to be in there too. Then he goes on to Edom. Edom is a country that was right next to Israel, just to the east of Israel. And Edom is going to be there. Edom was actually conquered before Egypt. The Babylonians went after Edom right after they destroyed Jerusalem. Then he talked about all the princes of the north and all the Sidonians are there. The princes of the north and the Sidonians, most biblical experts think he's talking here about Tyre and Sidon, which were the 2 main kingdoms in Lebanon, what's modern-day Lebanon today, and that would be to the north of Israel. So most people think that he's talking about Tyre and Sidon. We've covered those in previous classes, discussion of them. They were pagans and had armies as well that went out and conquered people. So their people are going to be there in Hades. They're uncircumcised as well. And then finally the Lord says, Pharaoh, he and all of his armies will see them. So Pharaoh's going to be in Hades. All of his people, his armies that held swords are going to be in Hades. And they're all going to be here with all these other people from all these Gentile nations. And they're going to be there in the pit. They're going to be there forever. Their spirits are going to be there forever. Now, as we go through here, you'll notice this one Gentile nation that's never mentioned in these 8 chapters. And that is Babylon itself. And the question is why. Babylon was every bit as bad as all these other people. So why is Babylon not mentioned in here? Well, we don't exactly know, but most people presume that the reason is that, remember, Ezekiel is sitting in Babylon when he's doing this, right? He's in front of a group of Jewish leaders sitting in Babylon, and if he all of a sudden starts talking about what's going to happen to the king of Babylon, that they're all going to be destroyed and go to Hades and all that, it might not be good for the Jewish people. There are a whole lot of Jewish people there. By the time this thing was over, there were 1 million Jews in Babylon, 1 million Jewish men in Babylon. There were 2 million Jews all total. So it might not be good for the Jews in Babylon if Ezekiel starts prophesizing that the king of Babylon and his army is about to go down to the pit and spend all eternity in hell. So for whatever reason, the Lord didn't give that to Ezekiel. If the Lord had given it to him, I think Ezekiel would have said it. But the Lord didn't give that to him, presumably for reasons of protecting the Jewish remnant. Remember, this was the remnant that was in Babylon, the people of Israel that would actually come back and reestablish Israel. So I don't think the Lord wanted to kill off his remnant. He wanted his remnant to come back. So that's the reasoning most people have as to why Babylon isn't on this list, and they weren't on the other list that we saw the other day as well. So most people think that that's probably what that was all about. Yeah, so the Lord has now shown us in these first 32 chapters, I'm just going to summarize where we are. First of all, that Israel's in great sin, and they're about to be judged for that sin, and Babylon's going to do that judgment. And all the Gentile nations around Israel aren't going to get off easy either, especially if they opposed Israel. There's a lesson for nations that oppose Israel today, by the way. The Lord is going to treat them harshly. He will judge them for their sin and judge them and send judgments against them. So, woe to countries even today that are against Israel. This is a biblical warning for countries around the world today that are against Israel. So that's where we are. We're at the break point now, and next week we're going to completely transition, and we're going to go into the future, what the Lord has in store now for Israel. Things are going to get better. We're at the low point here, the emotional low point, right? Israel's going to be horribly punished for their sins. All the Gentile nations in that part of the world are going to be horribly punished for their sins. But now things are coming back up. Next week we're going to start looking at what's going to happen in the future for them and how the Lord is going to prosper them in the future. That's where we're going next week. I have another minute or so left if there are any questions anybody has.
Do you think Egypt's going to be destroyed in the tribulation then? That's
what we saw the other day.
We're going to the millennium for a while and not.
What we saw the other day pretty much said that Egypt, but bear in mind, most of the world's going to be destroyed during the tribulation. If you were in my Revelation class, you know that there won't be a whole lot left of the world when Jesus comes back. There will be basically a place between Israel and Babylon, and most of that's going to be destroyed as well, especially the Babylon part. And then the Antichrist is going to come after Israel because it's the only place left in the world that he can survive in. So he'll bring his armies against Israel, and then the Lord's going to destroy those armies. So the only people left will be the Jews and other believers from around the world at that point. That's all that's going to be left at that point. So yes, Egypt will be destroyed during that whole process. The whole rest of the world will. America will too. Everything else is going to go down in that period during the tribulation. It's not going to be a pleasant 7 years to be any place other than Jerusalem. And even Jerusalem's not going to be great during that period. So yeah, I think Egypt will be destroyed during that period. And I think in Egypt's case, it won't get repopulated for another 40 years into the millennial kingdom. The rest of the world will start getting repopulated quickly. But the Lord makes clear that Egypt's going to have a special burden for 40 years into the millennial kingdom. That's how I understand it, and I think that's how most of the experts that I've read understand that. Other questions? Well, happy Sunday. Enjoy your church service today, and may the Lord bless you. And for those of you at home, may the Lord bless you as well, and we'll see you next week. I need to shut all the doors.